The USA had always seen Latin America as their backyard in which they had the right to interfere. This started with the Monroe Doctrine and continued with the Roosevelt Corollary and the Good Neighbor policy. The U.S. saw the emergence of leftist movements in different Latin American countries as threatening to its commercial interests and secretly plotted with military strongmen and those belonging to the middle class, whose interests concerned the land reforms and nationalization policies of new governments. By the early 1960s, left-wing revolutionary groups were fighting the U.S.-supported authorities in Guatemala, Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, and the Dominican Republic, and it would spread in the 70s and 80s. In Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz was voted president in 1950. He wasn't a communist, but some of his close allies were. Arbenz sought to modernize Guatemala's backward society by imposing the Decree 900 in 1952, which opposed the principles of feudalism by encouraging peasants to rise up against the upper classes and large foreign enterprises. This reform program had a strong appeal to the populations of Central American neighbors, where similar conditions prevailed. The Decree 900 especially threatened the agricultural monopoly of the United Fruit Company of Boston, who owned 500,000 acres of land, the railroad, the port, and telecommunications. The U.S. retaliated by engaging in some diplomatic negotiations during the Truman and Eisenhower administrations. The CIA spread panic in Guatemala. The Washington denied responsibility, and they warned the Soviets to stay out of the Western Hemisphere.
Obvious intervention of a foreign power, because these homegrown parties are not really homegrown. They're being funded or advised by a foreign power, i.e. the Soviet Union.
Я абсолютно убежден в том, что правительство Арбенса,
the Arbenz government, which had been in power from 1950, didn't enjoy any logistical support from the Soviet Union. We didn't even have diplomatic relations. There was no Soviet mission in Guatemala.
Finally, in 1954, the U.S. PB Success campaign staged a Guatemalan coup d'etat that provoked the 36-year Guatemalan Civil War from 1960 to 1996, in which about 200,000 Guatemalans were killed. After the coup, they even set up anti-communist committees where anyone could go to give the names of the people who had been loyal to the revolution, much like the show trials of Communist Russia and China. Chile had been calm in the 1960s, and Washington's Alliance for Progress program had spent millions of dollars backing Chile's Christian democratic government. Socialist Salvador Allende became president after winning the 1970 elections with less than half the vote. Allende's first step, supported by all Chilean political parties, was the nationalization of copper, Chile's biggest industry, still under effective U.S. control. In the Chilean countryside, peasants, chanting pro-Cuban slogans, began seizing the land. Nixon feared that Chile could become another Cuba. U.S. cut off most of its foreign aid to Chile and supported Allende's opponents during his presidency, intending to encourage Allende's resignation, his overthrow, or his defeat in the following elections. Chile's economy was increasingly put under state control. This upset foreign financiers and the World Bank in Washington, which cut off credits. U.S. meddling in Chile's economic and political spheres weakened Salvador Allende's grip on power. He was ultimately disposed by his own military, with CIA support, in 1973. The U.S. then supported Allende's government's replacement with a military junta led by Army Commander-in-Chief Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet later assumed power and ended Allende's elected Popular Unity government, instigating a campaign of terror on its supporters, which included the murder of former Foreign Minister Orlando Letelier. In January 1977, Jimmy Carter promised a new U.S. attitude to the rest of the world.
Announced that human rights would be a cornerstone or a foundation of our entire foreign policy. So I officially designated every U.S. ambassador on earth to be my personal human rights representative.
In Nicaragua, U.S. ambassadors were used to a different role. In the 1930s, U.S. Marines had put the tyrant Tacho Somoza in power. More than 40 years later, Nicaragua was still ruled by Somoza. Somoza's land was shared out and the family's business monopolies were taken over. Education and healthcare became widely available, but not everyone was happy with the revolution. The Sandista National Liberation Front overthrew Anastasio Somoza in 1979, ending the Somoza dynasty and established a revolutionary government in its place. Under the Sandinistas, conditions worsened for many.
Were subjected to confiscations and imprisonment. Their lives were threatened. Many were murdered just for disagreeing with the Sandinista front. This sort of thing turned many Nicaraguan peasants against the Sandinistas.
The United States secretly supported the Contras against the leftist Sandinista government. The tide of conservatism, which was to bring Ronald Reagan to power, was rising, and Reagan rejected the Sandinistas as pawns of the USSR, and he was more willing to do whatever it took to stamp out communism in the Western Hemisphere. An enormous scandal emerged when people in Reagan's administration were supporting the Contras over laws forbidding such support by the U.S. Congress. Eventually, military actions and economic sanctions pushed Nicaraguans into voting for anti-Sandinista politician Violeta Chamorro in 1990. The United States was paranoid and saw Soviet influence where there was little or none. The idea that communist insurgents would be invading across the Rio Grande was ridiculous propaganda. The USA failed to see the insurgencies of communists as rebels fighting for freedom against oppression. The anti-communist regimes the United States supported were brutal dictatorships who did not reflect the values the USA was claiming to defend. They could have supported true democracy, but didn't. The U.S. policy of containment was completely self-serving and did not account for the abject poverty and brutal conditions that the people of Latin America were forced to endure. The U.S. policy seemed driven by commercial interest who held sway in several presidential administrations. The U.S. policy perhaps had racial prejudice undertones, as it seemed that the Latin American people were not considered equal. The U.S. containment efforts in Latin America were an embarrassing episode that made them the bad guys.